We had so much positive feedback with our running back draft strategy video. We're doing the same thing here. I'm not just going to tell you the best wide receiver draft strategy. I'm going to prove it to you. I'm going to go back and look at historical data from 2017 through 2022, and we're going to try to find out a couple different things. One, where should you be taking league-winning wide receivers? Where do they come from? And two, what do they look like? Lastly, we are going to go round by round for your fantasy football draft this next season and help you identify the guys that have the possibility of being true league-winning players that we maybe want to target this next season. Now, first, let's go ahead and let's try to figure out where these guys come from. Now, we're going to be looking at data we pulled from RotoViz of historical win rates. And with these win rates, I want to be looking at all wide receivers that had a win rate over about 16.5%. The reason being is on average, an expected win rate for a player should be 8.5% if you're playing in a 12-team league. How you get there? Simple math. 12 teams playing, one team wins, 8.5%. So if you were to draft one of these wide receivers, you would be minimum twice as likely to win your fantasy football league if you did not. And that's what I classify as a league winner. Now, round one in 2017, you actually had Antonio Brown being a league winner. Now, what I want to point out is the difference in the amount of league winners that you've had with wide receivers versus with running backs. So dating back to 2017, we had 6-7 league-winning running backs coming from round one versus only one wide receiver being AB in 2017. Now we go to round two. Here you had one wide receiver, and that was Tyreek Hill this past season. Tyreek Hill, remember, going a little bit later because people were worried about him possibly declining with no Mahomes and instead with Tua. He was better, but we don't need to go down that road. But nonetheless, you had one wide receiver, and if we're going to be looking at running backs, you had two guys. Now, this is where things get very different. We begin to see more league-winning wide receivers in the middle rounds in comparison to running back. Going over to round three, you had two league-winning wide receivers. You had Tyreek Hill back in 2018. You had DeAndre Hopkins in 2017 as well. Whereas if you're looking at the running back list, you don't have two guys. Going over to round four, you had Juju Smith-Schuster in 2018. Running backs, you had no league winners. Round five, you had Cooper Kupp back in 2021. You did have a league-winning running back from round five. That was Josh Jacobs this past season. Y'all know my most drafted player in fantasy last year. Round six, you had two league-winning wide receivers. You had Stephon Diggs 2020, Jamar Chase in 2021. But then after that, round 7, 8, 9, 10, you only had one league-winning wide receiver. So what this data shows us is this shows us that middle round wide receivers, historically speaking, have been the best bets. Whereas if we compare this data to running backs, historically speaking, running backs have been the best bets if you're looking at rounds 1 and 2, or if you're looking at the end of your fantasy football draft chasing upside. Now, there are a couple different reasons for this. And the easiest way to break this down is by saying running back is won by opportunity. Wide receiver is won by talent. If you just think about it, right? If you give the running back the football and he can run in a straight line, if he has a great quarterback, he has a great head coach, he has a great offensive line, historically speaking, it hasn't mattered if he's an elite level talent or not. I mean, you can see running backs actually go out there and post 30-point performances, even if they're mediocre with the massive workload. Whereas wide receiver, you're never seeing league-winning players not have a ton of talent, right? Wide receivers, you actually have to go out there and earn your target. You have to create separation. Then you have to win at the catch point. Now, obviously, you still need a great quarterback, and the situation still is very important. But running backs are just given the ball. Wide receivers have to earn the ball. There's a pretty big difference between the two. And why we typically don't see any super late league-winning wide receivers is we typically know what wide receivers are talented, right? Historically speaking, we've been able to say, okay, yeah, Tyreek Hill's pretty good. DeAndre Hopkins, pretty good. Antonio Brown, pretty good. Let's draft these guys at the top of the draft, okay? Let's get these guys rounds 3 and rounds 4, and you're never getting that kind of talent falling to the double-digit rounds at wide receiver. So that's what this data tells us. Now, how should we implement this in our draft, and what kind of league-winning wide receivers should we look for? Now, I would say we are going to be heavily skewing to going running back out the gate, slamming wide receivers in the middle rounds, and then looking at running back at the very end of your fantasy football draft. Now, of course, I want to have a pretty big asterisk on this. If you are playing in best ball, it does not work that way. If you were playing in best ball, wide receivers at the end of your draft may actually matter a lot, right? Because if you're on Underdog and you draft someone as your wide receiver 6 and he turns out to be a wide receiver 3 in fantasy, that pick is very valuable. That's a massive spot. Whereas if you're in your ESPN draft and you draft a wide receiver 6 and he turns out to be a top 36 wide receiver, if you're only starting 2 wide receivers and 1 flex and you have to submit your starting lineup each and every week, it doesn't even matter that you were smarter than everybody else and you identified that league winning, quote unquote, good value. He's not going to win your league, right? He's not going to move the needle. Now, of course, if you can identify those late round wide receiver values on Underdog, a little bit different. And of course, quick side note, if you want to draft with us on Underdog, we're doing it every single day. I've not missed a single day of live streaming in over 100 days at this point. And of course, you can find the link to draft with us on Underdog Fantasy, which is best ball, no time commitment at all during the season. So I drafted 700 teams and won $150,000 last year. That link is in the comment section as well as the description. And if you sign up with promo code FLOCK, they're going to match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to $100. Plus, you'll get our 2023 fantasy football rankings, a free trial to flockfantasy.com, where you can find our 2023 fantasy football draft guide. And also, Underdog has all the player props you'll see in this video. My favorite prop right now is Drake London, more receiving touchdowns than Michael Gallup this next season. But now let's go round by round and let's try to identify where some wide receiver values are currently in your regular redraft leagues. Now, the first thing I want to do is skip by the first 2 rounds at wide receiver, right? We kind of already identified we generally want to be taking running back. Now, of course, if you can take Jefferson, you still go Justin Jefferson, okay? Don't just take this as black and white. Obviously, you have to take the value where it falls. Now, going down, starting at pick 24, so this is the 2-3 turn, you have Jalen Waddle. Now, if Jalen Waddle makes it to you in round 3, you better be going ahead and taking Jalen Waddle, especially if you're able to start off with, say, Christian McCaffrey and then Jonathan Taylor through the first 2 rounds, right? If you go CMC, Taylor, get the league-winning upside, and then go Jalen Waddle, who's a wide receiver 1 this past season, possibly going to see an even better year if Tua manages to stay healthy in 2023. Easy draft pick. You also have T. Higgins with an ADP of 32, Devonta Smith with an ADP of 33. Now, obviously, these wide receivers, very similar to Waddle, are wide receiver 2s in their respective offenses, but you can still pencil them in as low in wide receiver 1s at fantasy, high in wide receiver 2s. And if an injury were to go down in front of them, whether that's to Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, or maybe even AJ Brown, then all of a sudden those wide receivers would have top 5 upsides at their individual position. So I'm completely fine going Higgins, Devonta Smith as well. Outside of that, not too many round 3 wide receivers I'd be too excited about in your regular format. I mean, I'd rather go ahead and I'd rather take someone like, Lamar Jackson, Mark Andrews over DK Metcalf, over Deebo Samuel, to be honest. Now, going over to what we have in round 4. Here, you have some insane values as well. You have year 2 wide receiver in Chris Olave. He's penciled in right between Joe Burrow, Jahmyr Gibbs. You're also going to be looking at Keenan Allen, Amari Cooper. By far and away, my favorite value in this round is going to be Chris Olave. Now, I do think this is about the point where if you really wanted to, you could pivot over to quarterback. You could pivot over to tight end for this round in particular, if you're able to get either Lamar Jackson or Mark Andrews falling to you. And in general, those quarterbacks and those tight ends will be more important for you the fewer flex spots that you have and the fewer starting wide receiver slots that you have as well. We'll talk about that a little more depth later. Now, going over to round 5 is where things get extremely crazy, right? You have Calvin Ridley available in round 5 of these ESPN drafts. So if you wanted to, in your ESPN league, you could start off, say, going Christian McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor, and then you go Jalen Waddle, Chris Olave, and Calvin Ridley. In my mind, that shouldn't be allowed. There's no way I would ever be able to pull that off on Underdog. All those guys are going inside the top 3 rounds. But this goes to show that you're able to find wide receivers value later on in your regular redraft leagues where you're comparing Calvin Ridley to someone in this range, such as Rachaad White, where these guys are going back to back. Now, when we go over to our next round, we're going to be looking at Jerry Jeudy with an ADP of 51. I think Jeudy, especially with the Patrick injury, is very appealing at this price. I think Christian Watson is as well going into year 2. And outside of that maybe you throw in Deontay Johnson. My main 2 guys in this round will be Jerry Jeudy, Christian Watson. If you wanted to pivot over to go tight ends, if you really wanted to go grab Darren Waller, if that's your guy, I'm going to be fine with it. Because another thing that we have to talk about is, when do we stop drafting these wide receivers? Because I can keep going round by round and just finding great wide receiver values that I'm excited about, right? I mean, the next round, you're looking at Mike Williams. The round after, you're looking at Brandon Ayuk, Drake London. I would say really you don't see the teardrop at wide receiver until you're getting to about pick 90 to 100. And then at that point, it becomes a whole lot more appealing to pivot back over to running back. But we don't necessarily want to go running back then in rounds 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Only draft wide receivers if at the end of the day you can only start at most 3 to 4 in your starting lineup. So this will be very dependent on your league, and understanding your league settings is going to be crucial to implement any draft strategy this year. Now, if you can start, say, 3 wide receivers mandatory, and then also 2 or more flex spots, you do not have to be scared about, quote unquote, taking too many wide receivers. In that kind of format, there's almost no such thing as too many wide receivers. And if you can roll out 5 to 6 guys every week that you're excited about, hell yes, let's draft wide receivers rounds 3 through 10. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, if you're only going to be starting 2 wide receivers and 1 flex spot, then at that point, you really have a game of diminishing returns when you go to take that 4th, 5th, 6th wide receiver in a row. So if you're going to be playing in that league where at most you can only start 3 wide receivers, there I would also love to throw in an elite level quarterback into the mix. I would love to throw in an elite level tight end into the mix as well, because at the same time, if you're looking at those shallower starting lineups, the percentage output that the quarterback position as well as tight end are going to account for is going to be so much higher, where they will dictate your win rate a little bit more than otherwise. Now, as we go down to the very end of your fantasy football drafts, I want to illustrate that you don't want to be taking any wide receiver that has a capped ceiling, okay? Now, the guys I'm talking about here, someone like Jacoby Myers, pick 115. I would even throw in Juju Smith-Schuster, 113. I mean, hell, let's get Rondale Moore, 127. DJ Chark, 128. Now, those are guys that in Underdog best ball drafts can be appealing if you think that they're going to be, say, borderline low-end wide receiver 2s instead of wide receiver 4 and 5s this next year. If you can find that kind of value on Underdog, it makes a difference. But in your regular redraft league, we don't want to just be chasing a low wide receiver 2 finish. Even if you draft someone as the wide receiver 48 and they turn into the wide receiver 24, in reality, if you look at the raw difference in points per game, it's not going to move the needle. It's not going to make any difference for you whatsoever. So if you decide, Mason, I still want to be taking wide receivers as we get to the later rounds, maybe I went with an extra running back early on and I need to catch up on wide receiver depth. Instead of going with those low ceiling options, you really need to swing for the fences, and you need to take some guys that have extremely wide ranges of outcomes. Now, the easiest way to do this is take the players that we have the least information on, because inherently they're going to be discounted because they're quote unquote risky, even if we know they're not Jacoby Myers. They don't have a cap ceiling. Maybe they can turn into a wide receiver 1 in fantasy. Those guys would be a player like Jordan Addison, who is an ADP of 109. I mean, hell, I would even go ahead, throw in Zay Flowers, ADP 133. I would throw in Quentin Johnston as well. I mean, Johnson at this point is 134, right next to Zay Flowers, because with those rookies, at least they have upside to move the needle for you. By no means am I saying that they're going to be a guaranteed hit. By no means am I saying that they're going to go out there and they're going to win your league this next season. But at least they have a chance. Whereas someone like Adam Thielen, DJ Chark, I mean, Jacoby Myers, there's no way in hell. What's going to happen if you start taking wide receivers with that prototype at the very end of your roster is they're never going to be bad enough to cut and go get someone that actually has the real upside, but they're also never going to be good enough to make a real difference in your starting lineup. There are always going to be those borderline waiver wire options, and you're always going to be able to find someone like that during the season on the waiver wire if you really need them, so there's no reason to draft them in your fantasy football draft. Now, if we're looking even deeper The only guys that I would say that you possibly want to be taking a swing on as you get to the very end of your draft in rounds like 15, 16, 17 are the secondary wide receivers where we don't know what their role is in elite level offenses. Now, the examples of players that look like that would be Elijah Moore, ADP 152. And y'all know Kadarius Toney, we put out so much info earlier this offseason calling him the worst pick in fantasy football drafts. But that was back when he was going in round 6 in underdog drafts. Now he is a much more reasonable price tag. And I'm willing to say, yeah, he's a big question mark. He's a massive risk. And people that were drafting him in round 6 over Mike Evans on Underdog were losing their minds, and I have no idea what the hell they were doing. But if you can get him in the last round, the second to last round of your fantasy draft, he has upside and he's worth the pick, right? ADP 158 right now on ESPN. We can slide this down. I mean, you can just go with a couple other of those Kansas City Chiefs wide receivers. If you really wanted to grab Sky Moore at the very end of your draft, if you really wanted to grab Rashee Rice at the very end of your draft, that's another route that you can go because you know for a fact they'll be in an elite level offense. The overall depth chart is a little bit murky, so you are getting a general discount on those players, but you don't want to stack up your team with too many of those options. You would rather take the running backs at the very end of your draft than maybe if an injury occurred in front of them or if they signed to a great landing spot, they could actually turn into league-winning options where these wide receivers are going to have a much harder time in doing so. So let me reiterate what we're doing here. We are slamming wide receivers in the middle rounds. Rounds 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That is where we want to be taking our shots. The more starting wide receiver slots, the more flex spots you have in your starting lineup, the more willing you're going to be to go through and push wide receivers up and take an extra, and take an extra, and take an extra. But we don't want to be wasting our roster spots at the very end of our bench on wide receivers that may have a high floor but a low ceiling, because you'll always be able to go to the waiver wire and find someone of that prototype. But I think that's all I have for you. Again, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I really, really do appreciate you. I really hope that you were able to get something from this. And if you were, go down there, drop a like, subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football. And if you want to get in a draft with us, or if you want to go check out any of those player props, you can on Underdog Fantasy. Sign up to Underdog with promo code FLOCK. They're going to match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to $100. It'll get our 2023 fantasy football rankings. Get a free trial to flockfantasy.com, or you can find our draft guide for this next year. But thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. Really do appreciate you and really hope I get a draft against you in a live stream tonight.